In the pre-dawn darkness of March 14th, satellite phones across the Persian Gulf lit up with the same chilling message. Tehran had locked its coastal missile batteries onto every American military installation within range, and the USS Gerald R. Ford, trapped inside the Strait of Hormuz, was now sitting in the crosshairs of over 200 Iranian anti-ship missiles. War was no longer a question of if, but of which second it would begin. The most powerful navy on Earth had just sailed into a kill zone it could not escape. The countdown to this catastrophe had begun 72 hours earlier, when B-2 Spirit bombers lifted off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, their bat-wing silhouettes cutting through the night sky on a 15-hour flight that would take them across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and into the airspace above Iran. Their targets were deeply buried facilities, underground complexes carved into the Zagros Mountains, where Western intelligence believed Iranian engineers were within weeks of assembling a nuclear warhead. The B-2s carried GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs designed specifically to crush reinforced concrete and reach the chambers beneath. At 3:47 a.m. local time, the first bombs fell. F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters, launched from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, flew ahead as escort and electronic warfare platforms, jamming Iranian radar networks and painting targets for the bombers behind them. The initial strikes hit the Natanz enrichment facility, the Fordow underground complex near Qom, and a suspected weapons assembly site outside Isfahan. Secondary explosions rippled through the mountainside as stored fuel and munitions cooked off, sending pillars of fire into the sky, visible for 50 miles in every direction. But the Americans had underestimated the depth of Iran's air defense network. Within minutes of the first impacts, Iranian S-300 surface-to-air missile batteries activated across the central plateau. The S-300 PMU-2 system, one of the most capable air defense platforms in the world, began tracking the F-35s as they banked away from their target runs. While the F-35's stealth characteristics reduced its radar cross-section, the planes were not invisible, especially when their weapons bay doors opened to release ordnance. An S-300 battery positioned on a ridge near Isfahan acquired an F-35 at the precise moment its bay doors cycled open and fired a 4.8 N6E2 interceptor missile. The projectile, traveling at Mach 6, closed the distance in seconds. The F-35 pilot, callsign Hatter 4, never saw it coming. The missile detonated 30 feet from the aircraft's tail section, shredding the right stabilizer and sending the fighter into an uncontrollable spin. The pilot ejected over the Dasht-e-Kavir desert, and within the hour, Iranian Revolutionary Guard ground units were mobilizing to capture him. One F-35 had been lost, its wreckage scattered across the salt flats, and with it, some of the most closely guarded aviation technology on the planet. In the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, the mood shifted. This was not going to be a clean operation. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps responded with a speed that stunned American planners. Within 6 hours of the B-2 strikes, the IRGC had mobilized its entire coastal defense infrastructure along the Strait of Hormuz. Mobile launcher trucks carrying Khalid Far's anti-ship ballistic missiles rolled out of hardened shelters in the mountains overlooking the strait, their transporter erector launchers raising into firing position on cliffside roads that had been carved into the rock specifically for this purpose. The Khalid Fars, a derivative of the Fateh 110 solid-fuel ballistic missile, was designed with one purpose: to kill ships. It carried a 650-kilogram warhead and used an infrared seeker in its terminal phase to home in on the heat signature of a carrier deck or destroyer exhaust. At its maximum range of 300 kilometers, it could reach any vessel in the Persian Gulf within 90 seconds of launch. Alongside the Khalid Fars, the IRGC deployed shorter-range Fateh 110 batteries, positioned to cover the central and eastern approaches to the strait. On the water, the IRGC Navy launched its fleet of fast attack craft, small, agile speedboats armed with anti-ship missiles, heavy machine guns, and rocket launchers. These were not warships in any conventional sense. They were swarm vessels designed to overwhelm a carrier group's defenses through sheer numbers and unpredictable movement patterns. Within hours, over 150 of these boats were operating in the southern Persian Gulf, weaving between commercial shipping lanes, making it impossible for American forces to engage them without risking catastrophic collateral damage to civilian vessels. The USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group had entered the Persian Gulf 4 days before the strikes, a show of force intended to deter Iranian retaliation. Now that decision looked like a catastrophic miscalculation. The Ford, a 100,000-ton nuclear-powered supercarrier carrying 75 aircraft and over 5,000 personnel, was the most valuable single target in the United States Navy. It was accompanied by 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, the USS Gravely, the USS McFall, and the USS Thomas Hudner, each armed with Aegis combat systems and standard missile interceptors designed to defeat incoming threats. But the Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest point, only 21 miles wide, offered almost no room to maneuver. The Ford was a knife in a gunfight, too big to hide, too slow to dodge, and too deep in enemy waters to retreat before the trap closed. Iranian mine layers had been active for days, sowing the northern approaches to the strait with EM-52 acoustic mines and Manta influence mines. The southern channel, the only viable exit route, was now covered by the Khalij Fars batteries in the mountains. The Ford was boxed in. At 2:15 p.m. on the second day of the conflict, the first wave of Shahed 136 kamikaze drones launched from mobile sites on Keshem Island, an Iranian territory that jutted into the strait like a dagger. The Shahed 136 was a loitering munition, small, slow, and cheap, costing roughly $20,000 per unit. It carried a 50-kilogram warhead and flew at a cruising speed of 185 kilometers per hour, low enough to skirt the radar horizon and small enough to challenge the Aegis system's ability to track and prioritize it. The IRGC launched 40 of them in the first wave, sending them in a ragged formation toward the carrier group. The destroyers opened fire immediately. The USS Gravely's Mark 45 5-inch gun barked in rapid succession, each shell costing more than the drone it was trying to destroy. Phalanx close-in weapon systems on the destroyers and the carrier itself spun to life, their 20mm Gatling guns spitting 4,500 rounds per minute into the sky. The sound was deafening, a mechanical roar that echoed across the water and mixed with the high-pitched whine of the Shahed's mopeds-like engines. 28 drones were destroyed, but 12 got through. 7 struck the USS Gravely, hitting its superstructure, helicopter hangar, and aft missile deck. The damage was not fatal, but the ship was crippled, its radar systems degraded, its forward VLS cells damaged. 3 drones struck the USS Thomas Hudner, starting fires in the crew quarters. 2 more slammed into the Ford's flight deck, punching through the non-armored sections near the landing area and starting fuel fires that took 90 minutes to control. 11 American sailors were dead, 47 were wounded, some critically, their burns so severe that the carrier's medical bay was overwhelmed within the first hour. The Ford's air wing launched a counterstrike. F/A-18E Super Hornets from VFA 143 and VFA 25 roared off the deck, armed with AGM-154 joint standoff weapons and AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles. Their targets were the Iranian S-300 radar sites along the coast. But the IRGC had learned from years of watching American tactics. They shut down their radars, moved their launchers to pre-surveyed alternate positions inside hardened shelters, and waited. The Super Hornets struck empty revetments and destroyed decoy emitters that had been broadcasting fake radar signatures. 2 Hornets flew too low over a coastal battery and were engaged by a Tor M1 short-range air defense system. 1 was hit and its pilot ejected over the Gulf, where he was recovered by an American SH-60 Seahawk helicopter under fire from IRGC fast boats. The other escaped with shrapnel damage to its engine nacelle and limped back to the Ford on a single engine, landing hard enough to snap the arresting cable and shut down flight operations for 40 minutes. Who on earth authorized sending a $13 billion carrier into a 21-mile-wide strait against an enemy with hundreds of anti-ship missiles? That question was being screamed in the corridors of the Pentagon, in the Situation Room of the White House, and in the wardrooms of every ship in the Gulf. It was the kind of decision that would end careers, destroy reputations, and cost lives for years to come. Would you have sent the Ford in, or kept it in the Arabian Sea, where its aircraft could still reach Iran, but the ship itself stayed out of the Khalij Far's envelope? The answer seemed obvious now in hindsight. It always does. On the third day, the IRGC escalated. At dawn, a salvo of 8 Khalij Far's missiles launched from the coastal mountains east of Bandar Abbas. They arced upward on columns of smoke and fire, their solid fuel motors burning out within seconds, leaving them to descend on ballistic trajectories toward the carrier group at Mach 3. The Aegis system on the USS McFall detected the launch almost immediately and began computing intercept solutions. Standard Missile 3 and SM-6 interceptors launched from the McFall's vertical launch system, each one a $10 million bullet designed to hit a bullet. 4 of the 8 Khalij Far's missiles were intercepted, the collisions producing brief, violent flashes of light in the upper atmosphere as the kinetic warheads met their targets at combined speeds exceeding Mach 8. But 4 got through. One splashed harmlessly 200 meters from the Ford, its shockwave rattling the hull and shattering windows on the carrier's island superstructure. 2 more were decoyed by chaff and flare countermeasures and impacted the water harmlessly. The 4th missile, however, was a direct hit. It struck the USS McFall amidships, the 650-kilogram warhead detonating inside the ship's machinery room. The explosion was catastrophic. The blast tore through the engine room, severing the propulsion shaft and rupturing the ship's fuel lines. Secondary explosions ripped upward through the deck, blowing out a 15-foot hole in the hull above the waterline. The McFall, a 9,200-ton destroyer commissioned in 2009, went dead in the water within minutes. Fires raged unchecked as the crew fought to save their ship. 23 sailors were killed outright. Another 60 were injured, many trapped below decks in smoke-filled compartments. The ship listed 14 degrees to starboard as seawater poured through the breach. Within 3 hours, the captain gave the order to abandon ship. The USS McFall became the first American warship sunk by enemy action since 1945. The news hit Washington like a physical blow. In the Situation Room, the president sat in silence as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff delivered the briefing. The Secretary of Defense's hands were shaking. The Director of National Intelligence was pale, her voice barely above a whisper as she explained that the intelligence community had assessed Iran's coastal missile capability as moderate and unlikely to achieve multiple hits against Aegis-equipped vessels. That assessment was now lying at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, along with 23 American sailors. The president addressed the nation at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. His speech was brief, measured, and terrifying in its implications. He confirmed that the United States had conducted strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities to prevent the regime from acquiring a nuclear weapon. He confirmed that the USS McFall had been lost with 23 crew members killed. He confirmed that the USS Gerald R. Ford remained in the Persian Gulf and was continuing flight operations. And he issued a warning that stopped the world cold. Any further Iranian attacks on American forces would be met with a response, and he used the word overwhelming, so devastating that the regime in Tehran would not survive it. The stock market crashed 1,800 points in after-hours trading. Oil prices spiked to $210 a barrel, then $240, then $310 as traders panicked over the prospect of the Strait of Hormuz being closed indefinitely. 20% of the world's oil supply passed through that 21-mile channel. Every tanker captain in the Gulf was now weighing his life against his cargo, and most were choosing life. In Tehran, the supreme leader met with the IRGC High Command in a fortified bunker beneath the city. The mood was not triumphant, but grim. The American strikes had inflicted serious damage on the nuclear program. The Natanz facility was destroyed, its centrifuge halls collapsed and burning. Fordow was severely damaged, though the deepest chambers might have survived. The Isfahan site was a crater. 14 Iranian scientists and technicians were confirmed dead, along with 40 IRGC personnel killed in the airstrikes and air defense engagements. But the sinking of the McFall had shifted the psychological balance. For the first time in 40 years, Iran had killed Americans in a conventional military engagement and survived the retaliation. The supreme leader authorized the next phase, a full closure of the Strait of Hormuz. He instructed the IRGC Navy to begin mining the central channel and to attack any vessel attempting to transit, regardless of flag. The order was transmitted to coastal commands at 4 a.m. Tehran time. The crisis now consumed the entire world. The United Nations Security Council convened in emergency session at 3 a.m. New York time. The American ambassador demanded a resolution condemning Iran's attacks on U.S. forces and authorizing collective military action to keep the strait open. The Russian and Chinese ambassadors walked out of the chamber before the vote, rendering any resolution impossible. Global leaders issued statements that ranged from cautious to hysterical. The British Prime Minister offered Royal Navy assistance. The French President called for immediate de-escalation. The German Chancellor warned of an energy catastrophe that would make the 1973 oil crisis look trivial. Japan, which imported 80% of its oil through the strait, went to DEFCON 2 and placed its maritime self-defense force on high alert. India deployed warships to the Arabian Sea to protect its energy shipments. None of them fired a shot. This was not their war. It was a duel fought in a narrow body of water between two nations that had been moving toward this moment for 45 years. Back in the Gulf, the situation aboard the Ford was deteriorating. The carrier had been conducting round-the-clock flight operations for 72 hours, and the crew was exhausted. The flight deck was a chaos of jet blast, spinning propellers, and exhausted plane captains waving wands in the darkness. The medical bay was still treating burn victims from the Shah's strikes. The ship's supply officer reported that the Ford had enough aviation fuel and munitions for 4 more days of intensive operations, after which it would need to withdraw to resupply. But resupply was impossible as long as the strait remained contested. The Ford's captain, a 25-year Navy veteran with calm eyes and a voice that never rose above conversational volume, walked the bridge wing at midnight and watched the burning hulk of an abandoned oil tanker drift past on the current. The tanker had been hit by an Iranian anti-ship missile 12 hours earlier, its crew evacuated by a passing container ship. The fire painted the water orange and black, and the heat could be felt from 500 yards. He thought about his crew, about the 11 sailors who had died on his flight deck, about the 23 who had died on the McFall. He thought about the 5,000 families back home who were watching the news and wondering if their son or daughter or husband or wife was still alive. And he thought about the mountains on the horizon, where hundreds of Iranian missiles sat in their launchers, waiting for the order to fire. He did not know if he would get his ship out. Nobody did. The United States Navy did what it does best. It adapted. Attack submarines of the Virginia class, already positioned in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, began launching Tomahawk land attack missiles against Iranian coastal defense sites. The USS New Mexico and the USS Indiana, running silent at 200 feet below the surface, each fired 20 Tomahawks in a coordinated strike that targeted IRGC command centers, radar installations, and known missile storage sites along the Iranian coast from Bandar Abbas to the Musandam Peninsula. The Tomahawks flew at low altitude, following terrain contours, their turbofan engines humming quietly as they crossed 150 miles of desert and mountain. 32 of the 40 missiles reached their targets. Several IRGC facilities were destroyed, including a command bunker near Bandar Abbas that killed 6 senior IRGC officers. but the mobile launchers survived. They had been designed to survive. The Khalij Far's trucks simply drove back into their mountain shelters after firing, reloaded from hidden stockpiles, and emerged at new positions within hours. The Americans were fighting a whack-a-mole war against an enemy that had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this scenario. On the ground, the United States Marine Corps launched a daring raid against an IRGC missile launch site on the Musandam Peninsula, the strategic point that controlled the southern entrance to the strait. A force of 200 Marines from the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit, transported by MV-22 Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft from a forward staging base in Oman, landed at dawn on a plateau overlooking an Iranian coastal missile battery. The Marines were equipped with Javelin anti-tank missiles, SMAW shoulder-launched assault weapons, and night vision goggles that turned the pre-dawn darkness into a green-hued daylight. They approached the battery from the rear, moving through rocky terrain that the IRGC had believed impassable to a ground assault. The firefight lasted 40 minutes. The IRGC garrison, roughly 60 soldiers, fought fiercely but was outgunned and outmaneuvered. The Marines destroyed 3 Khalij Far's launchers and their associated radar vehicles, then exfiltrated by Osprey before Iranian reinforcements could arrive. 7 Marines were wounded, 2 critically. 18 IRGC soldiers were killed. The raid was a tactical success, but a strategic pinprick. There were dozens more launch sites scattered across 400 miles of coastline, each one capable of closing the strait on its own. By the 4th day, the world was holding its breath. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed. Insurance rates for shipping transits had gone from $20,000 to $1.5 million per voyage, and no captain was willing to risk it. 17 tankers were anchored in the Gulf of Oman, waiting for a resolution that seemed increasingly unlikely. Global oil supply had contracted by 18%. Gasoline prices in the United States hit $7.50 a gallon. American drivers lined up at pumps that were running dry, and the economic damage was spreading like a shockwave through every sector of the economy. The president's approval rating, which had spiked to 71% in the immediate aftermath of the strikes, was now at 44% and falling. The American public supported the troops, but was beginning to question the strategy. How do you fight an enemy that can sink a billion-dollar destroyer with a missile that costs less than the interceptor you use to shoot it down? Can the United States really afford a war where every engagement costs 100 times more than the enemy spends? Is there a way out of this that does not end with American bodies coming home in flag-draped coffins and the global economy in ruins? These were not abstract questions anymore. They were being asked in kitchen tables and bar rooms and congressional offices across the country, and nobody had a good answer. The IRGC launched its most ambitious attack on the 5th day. At 6 a.m., a coordinated strike involving 60 Shahed drones, 12 Khalij Far's ballistic missiles, and 8 Fateh 110 short-range ballistic missiles targeted the Ford carrier group simultaneously. The attack came from 3 directions: drones from Keshem Island to the west, Khalij Fars from the mountains to the north, and Fateh 110s from launchers hidden in the coastal marshes to the east. The Aegis system was overwhelmed. The Gravely, still damaged from the earlier attack and operating with a degraded radar, could not track all incoming threats simultaneously. The Thomas Hudner, with fires only recently extinguished, struggled to bring its weapons systems online. The Ford itself became the primary defender, its phalanx systems and rolling airframe missiles filling the sky with metal and explosives. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. It was the longest 7 minutes in the lives of every sailor in the carrier group. The sky was a nightmare of streaking lights, explosions, and burning debris falling into the sea. 41 of the 60 drones were destroyed. 7 of the 12 Khalij Far's missiles were intercepted. 4 of the 8 Fateh 110s were shot down, but the rest got through. 1 Khalij Far's missile struck the Ford's flight deck just forward of the island's superstructure, the 650-kilogram warhead punching through the flight deck and detonating in the hangar bay below. The explosion was devastating. Two FA-18 Super Hornets were destroyed in the hangar, their fuel and munitions adding to the inferno. A section of the flight deck, 40 feet across, was simply gone, a smoking crater where steel and concrete had been moments before. Fire crews fought the blaze for 4 hours. 19 sailors were killed, 80 were wounded, many with burns and shrapnel injuries. The Ford could no longer conduct flight operations. Its air wing, still in the air when the strike hit, was diverted to bases in Qatar and the UAE. The most powerful warship in the world was wounded, limping south at 12 knots, escorted by the battered Gravely and Thomas Hudner, trying to reach the relative safety of the Gulf of Oman. The image of the USS Gerald R. Ford burning in the Strait of Hormuz, captured by a commercial satellite and leaked to the press within hours, became the defining image of the war. It was on every screen in the world. In Tehran, crowds filled the streets, chanting and firing weapons into the air. In Washington, the silence was heavier than sound. The president was told that the Ford had been hit. He put his head in his hands and did not speak for 90 seconds. When he looked up, his eyes were red and his jaw was set. He turned to the Secretary of Defense and said 3 words: "End this now." The secretary asked what he meant. The president repeated himself, "End this now, whatever it takes." The Pentagon began planning a full-scale escalation. B-2 bombers were being readied for a second strike package, this time targeting not just nuclear facilities, but IRGC command and control nodes, government buildings in Tehran, and the leadership of the regime itself. The USS Harry S. Truman Carrier Group was racing south through the Red Sea, 48 hours from the Gulf of Oman. Marine and Army units were being mobilized for potential amphibious assaults on Iranian coastal positions. The United States military was preparing to bring its full weight to bear against a nation of 88 million people, and the consequences of that decision were almost too vast to comprehend. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but felt by every person in that room, was whether the United States could win a war against Iran without triggering a regional conflagration that would make Iraq and Afghanistan look like skirmishes, and whether the American people, after 20 years of war in the Middle East, had the stomach for another one. Can Iran actually close the Strait of Hormuz for more than a few weeks, or is this a bluff that will collapse the moment American ground forces move in? The answer depends on something no satellite can see and no intelligence agency can predict: the will of the people on both sides. The IRGC fighter in his mountain bunker, watching the American carrier burn through his binoculars, believes he is defending his homeland against an empire that has been trying to destroy it for 45 years. The American sailor trapped below decks on a burning ship, choking on smoke and trying to reach a hatch that may already be warped shut, believes he is fighting for his country and his crew. Both of them are right. Both of them are wrong. War does not care about right and wrong. It cares only about physics, geography, and the terrible arithmetic of casualties. On the 6th day, a fragile ceasefire took hold. It was not negotiated, it simply emerged from exhaustion. The Ford had limped out of the strait and was steaming south toward the Gulf of Oman, her damage control parties still fighting smoldering fires in her lower decks. The Iranian missile batteries had exhausted their immediate supply of Khalij Fars missiles and were waiting for resupply from their underground factories. Both sides needed time, and for the moment, time was the only thing they could agree on. The United States had lost a destroyer, 2 F-35s, 2 FA-18, and over 60 sailors killed in action. The Ford was severely damaged and would require 18 months in dry dock to repair. Iran had lost its primary nuclear facilities, a significant portion of its air defense network, several IRGC command centers, and hundreds of soldiers. The Strait of Hormuz was littered with debris, burning oil, and the bodies of sailors from both sides that the sea would eventually claim. The world economy was in crisis. Oil was at $340 a barrel. Global shipping was in chaos. Nations that had nothing to do with the conflict were facing economic collapse because 21 miles of water had become a war zone. The ceasefire held, barely, for 72 hours. Behind closed doors, diplomats from a dozen countries were working frantically to turn the pause into something permanent. But on both sides, the machinery of war was still turning. American bombers were still loaded. Iranian missile factories were still running. The Ford's air wing was still sitting on runways in Qatar, its pilots sleeping in shifts, waiting for the call to go back. And in the mountains overlooking the strait, the Khalij Far's launchers were being reloaded, their erectors rising slowly against the dawn sky, pointing toward the sea where the next carrier would eventually come. Think about this for a moment. The United States spends $880 billion a year on its military. Iran spends roughly $25 billion. And yet, in the narrow waters of the Persian Gulf, that disparity meant almost nothing. A $30 million destroyer was sunk by a missile that cost $200,000 to produce. A $13 billion carrier was crippled by a weapon that was built in a factory underneath a mountain. The old rules of military power, the rules that said whoever spends more wins, were being rewritten in real time, and nobody on either side had figured out what the new rules were. If you were sitting in the Oval Office right now, with the Ford burning and the economy collapsing, and 5,000 families waiting for news about their loved ones, what would you do? Would you escalate, knowing that a full-scale war with Iran could kill tens of thousands of people and destabilize the region for a generation? Or would you back down, knowing that retreat would be seen as weakness by every adversary watching from Beijing to Moscow to Pyongyang? There is no right answer to that question. There is only the answer you choose and the consequences you live with. The war did not end, it paused. And in the silence of that pause, the world began to understand something that it had been trying not to think about for years. The age of the aircraft carrier, the age of American naval dominance, the age when a single supercarrier could project power anywhere on Earth without consequence, was over. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced warship ever built, had been driven out of the Persian Gulf by a nation with a fraction of its budget and a fraction of its technology. The implications of that fact would reshape the global order for decades. The Iranians knew it, the Americans knew it, and every government watching from the sidelines knew it too. The next war would not be fought the way the last one was. The rules had changed. The water was still burning.